Welcome, Tired F1 pod listeners. Today, we are doing the very first of our debates, a new little initiative that we thought we'd start, where we're going to take questions that have vexed Formula One fans for years, and sometimes not for years. We're going to debate them, and we're going to come to a consensus. It's going to be the same format every week, and the ground rules, just to remind everyone, are pretty straightforward. Each of us are going to take one side of an argument. We're going to present our case for 5 minutes. Then we're going to have a chance to argue it out between ourselves. And finally, one of us is going to have to bully the other into conceding their point so we can come to consensus. So without further ado, the first topic that we've got is based on Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari in 2025. One of the questions that's come up is this really a good move in terms of the teammate that he's going on to face at Ferrari in 2025? So the first question is very simple. If you're Lewis Hamilton, who would you rather have as a teammate? Is it George Russell or Charles Leclerc? So taking on Charles Leclerc is the better teammate for Lewis Hamilton to have is Amar. Amar, are you ready for this?
I was born ready, man. I was born ready. Other than being tired, I'm always ready. So this is
Fighting talk.
there you go. That's how this works, right? So the 5 minutes is plenty of time. Come on. Now, I'd like to start by reminding everyone that Lewis Hamilton has already made this choice. So this is a little bit of, like doing things in the hindsight. But I look at this question in a couple of different ways, right? So who's the better driver? And who is the better teammate, right? It's probably a sort of a good way to get this started. And there's no doubt that the better driver is Charles Leclerc, right? I mean, the results speak for themselves. Charles has 5 wins. George has one. Charles has plenty of podiums. I think close to 30 podiums, if not more. George has, I think, maybe just over 10 or 12, right thereabouts. Charles has a ton of poles, right? Like one of the things I wish Formula One would hand out points for poles. He'd probably be world champion by now. But he's got a massive number of poles compared to Russell. So I think in some ways Charles is the more accomplished driver. You look at his rise to stardom and sort of being at the front of the team. He is, at least as of right now, the de facto leader at Ferrari. That will probably get shifted slightly, ever so slightly, for the few years that Lewis Hamilton is there. But he's clearly established himself as the better of the two drivers. He is fastest over one lap in any given race at any given time, right? And to be honest, the car has not supported him as well as it could. I think he's the better teammate to have, only because if Lewis and Charles being on the same team can really take Ferrari forward. That's something they really need. It's something they really haven't had, is two accomplished drivers in their own right pushing the team forward. And where Ferrari's at in this day and age, they really just need both drivers to kind of be at the top of their game. And so while Carlos has been great, he has not always been at the level that Lewis Hamilton brings. So if I were Lewis, and clearly he has made that decision, he'd want a teammate that he can go up against on a day in and day out basis and really raise the level, not just of his drive, but his team, their ability to focus on race day, get strategy calls correctly, win every element of the race weekend that there is. So in my mind, Charles is the better driver. Now, I've heard some debate about George being sort of mistake-free and Charles being a little bit more reckless. And I'd just like to put it out there that Charles has, yes, he's had mistakes. So has Max, so has Lewis, so has pretty much every driver that's ever tried to win anything, right? But in the last couple of years, I've always seen Charles push a little bit over the limit when he's really felt like he has had to do more. It's only driven by the fact that he is passionate about getting there, getting to win. And it's really probably just overstepped it just that little tiny bit, right? And thrown the car there. But some of the crashes are part of growing pains, growing movement, right? And Others are just a factor of Ferrari not getting things right. I mean, we've seen instances, for example, of how Ferrari have screwed up the pit strategy. That's left Charles upset, and so I cannot imagine what's going on in their cockpit. Whereas George has had, yes, albeit not a very competitive car, but he's never had to worry about any of that. So he's never really had to carry the team on his back in quite the same way that Charles has. And so therefore, in my mind, this is not even a debate. Like Charles is the better teammate. And if I'm Lewis Hamilton at this stage in my life, I'm a seven-time world champion. I need just that little bit more of motivation, that little bit more of a change of scenery. That's partly why he's picked Ferrari, is to go there, is to go alongside Charles and bring that team to the forefront, to be in it for every single race, to be in it to win every single race, and then fight for championships. So the competition is well welcomed, and I don't think that George would ever pose that kind of competition to him in the time that they were together. So yeah, I think hands down Charles is the better teammate. But I know you have a different take on this, so I'd like to hear what you have to say.
All right. That was a 4-minute debate there, man. Oof.
Well, I
Has
mean,
Amar left some stuff on the table?
probably, yeah. I'll bring some more back in the follow up to the follow up, right? But yeah,
Okay. All right. Uh, so my 5 minutes. Here we go. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Why George Russell is a better teammate for Lewis Hamilton to have? Here we go. 5 minutes. George Russell. So I hear you. I hear you that Charles maybe is a better driver than George is. Now that for me is a reason why George should be Lewis's teammate. You don't want a teammate that's snapping at your heels all the time. You want someone you can beat down every single race and not have to worry about, because the easiest way to beat the outsiders from your team is to have a nice, easy, cushy ride at home. Now, I don't think it's going to be that straightforward, and don't let anyone tell you that it is. But in terms of why I think it's George, I think I'm going to break this down into three things. The first is pace. Just like you said, I think Charles is probably the quickest driver, certainly over one lap, that there is in Formula One right now. And when you're Lewis Hamilton and you're up against George Russell, and George Russell has beaten you in the teammate head to head for qualifying in 2023 and was pretty close to where you were in 2022, I'd have to worry a little bit that I need to up my Saturday game a little bit. And I'll have to do that more against Charles than I would against George, I think. Especially if the car is a little bit wayward and isn't quite as honed as it could be. I think George is probably a little stronger. But as the car starts to come back towards Lewis, and we're expecting that the W15 will be a bit more to Lewis's liking, given that that's what he's driven the team to do, you might find that actually George falls off a little bit. Let's see. But certainly an out and out pace, Charles is the quicker guy. And if you want to win the head to head over a season, you'd rather have George than Charles. Second, tenure. Lewis has been at Mercedes for 11 years, right? He's been there since 2013, and he's going into his 11th season with the team. That means that, according to what I talked about a couple of weeks ago, I think that having a team that's built around what you need and yourself developing towards what the team has been developing means that there's a certain synergy that you've built up over years. And it means that it's much harder for somebody coming in from the outside to be able to penetrate that and break it up and immediately be a better bet than the incumbent. And George has done really well. And he's asserted himself certainly over the past couple of seasons. But as we saw from the standings in 2023, Lewis finished third, George finished eighth in the standings. That tells you something about how the synergy between team and driver is still there for Lewis and Mercedes. And Lewis then having to uproot everything and go to Ferrari and walk into somebody else's house where they've had the same thing for the last 4 or 5 seasons makes things trickier. trickier. I'm not saying insurmountable, but trickier than they would be if you were just having to deal with the guy that's come into your team from outside. Now you could argue George has been developed by Mercedes over that time, so he's less of an outsider than others would be. But he's still not been in the Formula One team. He's not been in that winning circle in the same way that Lewis has. So he doesn't have that to contend with. Number three, mentality. George has had a reputation for calling shots from the car, strategy from the car. And I think some of that is to his credit, but it's not a Carlos Sainz level of insight into what the race is telling him to do. It's much more short-term gain and less big picture thinking. This is what I need because this is what I can feel in the car right now. This is what's going to get me a couple of places ahead, even if it means that I'm going to lose places later. The Japanese Grand Prix last year was a prime example when he was up ahead of Lewis in the closing stages. But despite the fact that Carlos Sainz was catching them at a rate of knots, he didn't want to give up that position and risk losing both positions to Carlos Sainz. And actually, that wasn't big picture thinking. You've already lost that position at that point, George. Give it up. But that big picture thinking isn't there. It's just about the immediate gain and beating his teammate. Whereas Lewis, I think, has a much more big picture. I'll take the hits right now because it gets me a better position later on in the race, later on in the championship. And that, I think, that focus on just his teammate that George has or on the immediate is going to make him less reliable as a championship challenger. So I think, again, that makes George a sitting duck. Second, wheel to wheel, I think he's a little bit suspect. He's had a couple of clashes with Lewis. I'd accept that Qatar was definitely Lewis's fault. Lewis even admitted that. But in Baku, in the first couple of corners against Max, he was clumsy and ended up causing damage that he didn't need. In Vegas, also, the clash that he had with Verstappen, the reasoning being that he didn't see him, earned himself a 5-second penalty. Didn't need to do that, and that was a penalty that he wasn't able to reclaim. So he still needs to know where the threshold for a lunge is, and when it comes to wheel to wheel racing, what are the moves to go for and what are the ones to hold back on. That level of threshold isn't, I don't think he's quite got that yet. And that again puts Lewis in a better position against him. And the final thing, number three, is the errors. So we talk about Charles Leclerc making a bunch of errors. What about George's errors? And these are errors of consequence, right? So when he's in a position where he can make a difference and get a good result, he makes errors. It happened in Canada, where he was chasing Fernando and Lewis, and he put it in the wall. The team ultimately said that actually that didn't have any consequence on his pace later on, but actually he retired from that race, and I'm sure that had something to do with it. And in Singapore, when he was chasing Norris and Sainz for the win, under a bit of pressure from his teammate, what did he do? Put it in the wall. And those errors are still there, and they will cost him races. And when there's a championship on the line, you'd expect that actually the pressure goes up and those errors will get more frequent and have greater consequence. Lewis doesn't have those particularly, and Charles, for everything that you might say about him, when it comes to errors, it tends to be when the car isn't for him. But if the car is there, you'd expect him to get to the end of a race, and it's certainly what he did towards the end of the season last season. And he's shown that in as you say, in a number of wins and poles that he's had versus George. So there you go. That's my argument. George is a better teammate than Charles if Lewis wants to beat him.
That is an amazingly put, very academic like explanation. But I have things to pick out and pick on, so we can get into more debate now.
Let's go.
All right, so let's get into this whole idea of so the errors are fine. Yes, those errors are there, but in George's defense, if I may do so, He's only been in, I don't even know if we want to call Mercedes a championship winning car, right? The last couple of years. I mean, he's, it's not really been there. So I don't know. There's just that one time where, Lewis was out, right? I believe in Abu Dhabi, right? That he had that chance to win, and he was great when that happened, right? So yes, we have not been able to see him in a competitive enough car to do that. And I just feel like, again, if yes, those errors happened there from George, but they've also been largely because he's trying to make something out of really nothing, right? Like, I mean, Mercedes has really not been in a winning situation outside of, that one race in Brazil in 22. So I think that's fair. But if you're Lewis Hamilton, right, we're trying to talk about a champion's mentality, right? The idea of moving to Ferrari is not just the childhood dream of being at Ferrari, which of course every driver, and he said it himself, has it, right? So absolutely true. But you want to go at this stage in your career, you want to go to a place where you can work alongside another driver. And Lewis is very adept at doing that. I mean, he did that when his first year when he had to go alongside Alonso, and look how he fared. So having an excellent driver, a better driver, actually brings out the better in him. And I think you have the added bonus of, again, the team going in a different direction, in a much quicker correct direction than they would at Mercedes. So I don't think we can separate the other factors such as the direction of the car, everything else that goes on with that. I would agree with you that Lewis is going to have a harder time acclimating to a place where Charles has already been there. But in the aftermath of the announcement, I have seen nothing but love coming for Lewis, out of everything Ferrari related, everything Italy related. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he, just like he did with Brazil, like, become an honorary citizen of Italy in a couple of years. That could very well happen. So yes, is the climb a little bit harder? Sure. But the level of excitement in Lewis coming over has been nothing compared to what Charles has experienced in his extensions, not extension, right? There was never that level of joy, right? So yes, it will be challenging, but it is precisely the challenge you want. If you're a seven-time world champion, in my mind, the GOAT, I know people like to put qualifiers and say statistically the GOAT, but really the GOAT, right? And so, yes, this is something that you want. You want to be able to go up against Leclerc. You don't want to be alongside George and, just fighting for like who's going to be there. You want to be there fighting at the front. And again, you're doing it with Ferrari too. So yeah, what do you think about that?
So first of all, Lewis is a superstar, right? Like I agree. I don't think he cares who's in the car alongside him. I've said that before. And it's not like he was particularly scared about George being in that car with him. Yeah, there were the initial rumblings of, oh, I'd rather, I was keen to have Valtteri stay in the car in 2022. But actually, as soon as George was there, grumbling was completely silent. There was none of it. And he just went to work. And there were performances where you could just see where he just got like I'm just gonna have you. Like Japan in 2023 was definitely one of those races where he'd had a poor race in Singapore, or a poor weekend in Singapore at least, where Russell had probably had the legs on him. He just turned up in Japan and just said, "Nah, I'm not having this," and just boom, there he was. But what I'm talking about is in terms of if you're talking about having a team having a championship bid, and this is something that Peter Windsor talks about all the time. Actually, the way you want to do that is to have, a strong driver that the whole team is built around, and then a driver that is compliant. Now, George is never going to be particularly compliant, but in terms of the outright pace and ability that he brings, you'd rather have him than Charles, because I think Charles is a much quicker driver, and that he also shares that mentality of not really caring about who's in the car opposite him. So yeah, you can bring the politics to Charles, but Charles will just drive harder. He'll just drive faster. And whereas George, I think will, from what I've seen of him, will make excuses or try and turn things around to make things better for him. Whereas I don't think Charles does that quite as much. And I think that's an aggressive mentality to have. And you're talking about fighting at the front. Now, that's supposing that Ferrari are going to have a car that is fighting at the front in 2025 versus Mercedes. And perhaps that's the trajectory, but maybe we're making a bit more of that than we should do, because Ferrari it's not like Ferrari fundamentally changed their car this season. They started off with the lateral wash car that they started with in 2022. The Yorkshire Puddings was still on it at the beginning of 2023. So the fundamental architecture of the car hasn't changed. Their understanding of it might be better than what Mercedes have had, and perhaps that puts them on a better footing for next season. But if you're going to believe what's coming out of Brackley, they also seem to think that they've got a car that it's going to challenge, that they've learned what the flaws were of the 22, 23 cars, and are going to be back to their best. And the simulator apparently seems to bear that out. So in terms of a competitive proposition, how do we definitely know that the Ferrari is a step forward? We don't. So this for me purely comes down to who is going to be the more amenable teammate. And I think in terms of who Lewis thinks that he's going to be able to beat, more likely, I'd say that having 2 seasons where he's, not comfortably, but I think at least marginally has had the better of him. I think George Russell is the guy that you'd want to have in the other car. Although I do take your point that he probably doesn't care who's in the other car. He'll just go and beat whoever. That's his mentality. I agree with that.
He doesn't care. And the one thing that has kind of been talked about, but not enough, is what Mercedes did in giving him a short-term deal. There are reports that Lewis was never offered a long-term deal, and it seems like Toto Wolff had sort of, I don't know, either he wanted to make George the driver of the future, or maybe there's a Kimi Antonelli kind of situation coming into play, but it's pretty clear what they told him, right? Like he was not going to be the Alpha 1-2, right? So I think that is sort of one of the underrated but very important factors in there. And yeah, of course, being at Mercedes would be an advantage. And why would you give that up ever? But again, if you're a 7-time world champion, you've gone up against Alonso in your rookie season. You've been through all of that. Ferrari are hungry for victory. These things tend to work in cycles, right? Where you have one team dominant for a stretch of a period. And you've had Mercedes do that. He's been part of that dominant period. We're seeing what looks like another dominant Red Bull run, right? Probably this year as well. I mean, if you were to bet, that's kind of where it would go. And so it does seem like, and again, this is not a scientific take, but it does seem like it's Ferrari's turn. Like it's either Ferrari or Aston Martin, and no one believes that. Come on. So you're right. This is no more of a risk, I think, than staying at Mercedes, right?
Yeah,
like there's no more of a risk, right? So and my logic with why Ferrari will be better is this is again unscientific, right? But Ferrari knows what they did wrong. Lewis knows what Mercedes did wrong. So hopefully you put those two things together and you found the winning formula there. And I think there's some merit to that, right? Like, because it's not just Lewis that's coming. A lot of his engineers are coming. They know a lot about, how not to go about this, right? So,
But this isn't an argument about whether Lewis should go to Ferrari, right? Right. Well, I think I'm already with you. I think it's a good move, and all of the things that you've said make sense. But the one thing that I think the one thing that you've said that I have to concede is the tenure thing. Is that yes, Lewis has been there this whole time, but it seems like the winds are changing at Mercedes, and they essentially Fernando Alonso at Alpine mirrored that. They did exactly to Lewis what Alpine did to Fernando, and it's had the same result. It's driven their driver out the door, and you have to worry about whether that's gonna bite them in the butt a bit later on. And that's an advantage now for George, because he's now the tenured driver, and whoever's coming in is going to have to walk into his house. Although he's not been there for quite as long, but the question still stands that if you had to choose between being the established driver at a team and having somebody new come in, and bed themselves in while you're still in your prime, versus going to a brand new team at the age of 39 and having to take on the guy that's been there, his entire career has been managed by Ferrari. It's Ferrari. He lives for them. He's just signed a multi-year deal that reportedly was till 2029. You
No,
know,
and I completely agree with you. And this is why I think Lewis Hamilton went there, and this is why he should want Leclerc to be there. Okay. This is going to sound outrageous, but you heard it here first. I believe that Leclerc will help Lewis win his eighth title. Lewis is so
oh
keen. Whoa,
no,
watch out. Watch
not a
out now. I know. And
chance.
and for all of you Leclerc guys, don't at me, okay? Don't at me. But here's why. Clearly, I mean, look, Leclerc knew that Hamilton was coming into the four before he signed the extension. So there's a lot that we don't know, and this is all speculative, right? In many different ways. But it's fairly clear that
No
in
way.
some way, some whispers that we're like, hey, let's get Lewis's eighth, his eighth, the first for Ferrari in almost a decade and a half, actually a little bit more than that now, is going to be massive. And who knows? Hamilton was ready. I mean, there are rumors about it, him being ready to retire after 21 had Abu Dhabi gone the other way. He's probably going to leave and Leclerc's going to come in. So let's just say I'm going to
Nah,
make the
nah,
assumption
nah,
that
nah, nah, nah.
there were some
Okay.
whispers made like, hey, let's work it out. Let's get Ferrari to the front. Lewis is going to win one, and you want to go there. Let's just also, I know we're talking about George and Leclerc, but we cannot forget the fact that Mercedes has been a winning team for a decade, right? And more or less, right? And that stuff is hard to repeat over time. And it bears on the other driver as well. I think Russell's going to look at this with a little bit of regret and say, maybe I shouldn't have been begging to go to Mercedes, right? He was 1 year too late, right? If he had come on in 21, that would have been a different deal. He would have had really that competitive
Well,
car.
it would have made life much more difficult
Much
for
more
Lewis, I
difficult.
think.
Correct. It could have. Yes, absolutely could have. But I think, again, that's all the reasons you established about Charles being there. He knows that they will work together. Charles is not the kind of guy who, at least he hasn't shown himself to be the kind of guy that would, sabotage putting Ferrari ahead
Okay,
of
okay.
that. So I think in that regard, that would be a very workable partner, though.
But Amar, those are two different things, right? Sabotaging and just doing the best you can to win a title are two different things. Like I absolutely reject the notion that Charles will sit there and help Lewis Hamilton win his eighth title because ultimately, in a season where your car is capable of winning a
Okay.
championship, you have to go for that title because you don't know when that's going to come up again. And
Fair
if you
enough.
sit there and go, all right, I'm going to back off and let Lewis through because he has to win his eighth title. I'm sorry,
No,
there's
no, no.
no way that Charles is going to do that.
No one
And if
said
he
that.
did,
I didn't
you
say
just
that.
said that. You
I
just
did
said,
not
oh,
say.
he's gonna help him get his eighth title.
I
Nonsense.
s- I I
He's
said
gonna
there
do
were
what he can.
whispers.
No, no. He's gonna do what he can to maximize the car and maximize the team. If that means working with Lewis and synergizing their efforts and bringing them together, then so be it. But on the track, he's gonna be an animal. He's
Of
gonna want to win the
course.
title for himself, and he would be nuts not to. And it's the same thing that George is doing at Mercedes. But I think in that circumstance, I think when it comes down to pure pace and like who's going to give him a harder time on a Sunday, well, maybe not on a Sunday, but definitely on a Saturday, you'd expect that Charles going to be the guy that's going to give him a harder
No
time.
problem. No problem. Been there, done that, man. Been there, done that with Alonso. Been there, done the opposite with Bottas. Hey, I mean, come on. Been there, done that with Nico. Like we forget that too. Sure, if it ends up being that kind of season where Leclerc does end up beating Hamilton, even better. Even better. But why not aim high? Look, one of the things that is a key underlining theme in this move is that Lewis not only wants to like move away from what Mercedes has been doing, but he wants to go to a place where he can really feel that he's challenging himself to bring it to even the next GOAT level status, if there were going to be one more to be proven there. It's just that added bit of having that fierce competitiveness. And George is nowhere, to bring it back to this debate, he's nowhere in that same zip code. Like it isn't. It isn't. And him not being there affects the car, which ultimately affects the chances to win. It affects everything. It does.
Okay,
It really
okay.
just does. So
So Omar, just to conclude, because we're going to run out of time
yeah,
here,
let's
but
do it.
just to conclude this, what we're saying is that Charles Leclerc is the better driver, and to drive against him shows that Lewis is up for a challenge and that makes him the preferred teammate versus George, who isn't quite as quick, but and because of that, because he's less of a challenge, Lewis should choose Charles over George.
Absolutely. At this stage,
That,
in order to be the man, you got to beat the man. And the only other move that would have been acceptable, we can have this debate again, is to go to Red Bull and kick Max's ass. Like that would be the
okay,
next thing to do. So we can
sure.
have that debate at another day. But
I think
that's what you got to that's what you
we
got
may
to do.
well.
That's what you
That's
got
what
to
you
do.
got to do. I don't know. I think Lewis was faced with a teammate that was touted to be the next big thing, and he's not been knocked down, flattened, and shown the door. I mean, he has. He's shown himself the door. But I think I think Lewis now, after this season specifically, and we'll see it more in 2024, I think, especially if the direction of development has gone further towards what he wants. I think he's got the psychological edge over George a little bit this season. The crashes in Canada, the crash in Singapore, all of those things, and the fact that he finished so far behind him in the points means that George is already, I think, even if he won't admit it, has got it in the back of his mind that he's got an uphill struggle this season. And that's something that Lewis can use to his advantage. And I think that for me is why George Russell is the better teammate to have. And I'll take that to the bank.
All right. You go ahead and do right that. But champions aren't just made of those kind of normal,
Oof.
paths of least resistance. I will take this to the bank. And again, this is the idea. In order to be the man again, right? Which he's been the man for a while, you got to beat the man. And what better accomplishment than going to Ferrari, going and beating Charles, in getting Ferrari that elusive first championship in forever, and kind of making that happen. And for that, you want to be amongst the best. You do not want mediocrity anymore. That's partly why he's leaving. So I will take that to the bank and say Charles Leclerc is the better teammate than George Russell, hands down.
Oof. How are we gonna find consensus here then? We need an arbitrator.
We're gonna have to agree to disagree. How about that? What's wrong with that?
No, we can't do that. There has to be a winner. Who's willing to concede? Look,
all right. Here's what I'm willing to concede, right? If Mercedes does give him that car, right? And if again, this is like really be super speculative with like no earthly idea if that's possible, right? If the car is made in Lewis's direction and he can legitimately compete for race wins, I don't know if we can say he can win for championships. I think right now, in this moment, this year, having George as a teammate makes more sense. It really does. It really does.
There you go. That might be the closest we get to consensus, but there you have it. There you have it, Tired F1 pod listeners. George is the better teammate to have if you're Lewis Hamilton.
In 24 only.
And on that bombshell, we'll see you next time.